Hello, genealogists. This is Craig, and this is Just Genealogy. So today, I'm going to talk about some nuances associated with Quaker records and maybe a footprint, a plan for how you should pursue Quaker research. Now, Quakers are people that I really enjoy having for relatives because they have so many records. So I always assume that I need to look for Quakers in my family lines, especially if they're in the mid Atlantic and especially if they're here in the colonial period. And I haven't been disappointed. I have several Quaker families that when I started my research, I didn't know I had. One of them even was a Revolutionary War soldier, which I've talked about before. I think that if you're going to properly research a Quaker family, there are some nuances that you have to know. You want to familiarize yourself with the history of the Society of Friends, aka Quakers, just because you want to have context. You want to know what's going on. You want to know what they had to deal with. Were they being persecuted? Where they were at? Would there be situations that you need to know about in your research? For example, in Virginia, you have a lot of Quakers who are on the vestries, church vestries of the Anglican Church, and recognize that they're Quakers. It just happens. You have to wonder about that. And that's one of the nuances. Don't be surprised if you see a Quaker on a vestry in Virginia, for example. You want to know the monthly meeting because that's where a majority of the genealogically oriented records are going to be found. But you also want to know the nearby meetings because they tended to move back and forth between the meetings. So you want to not only look in the monthly meeting that they belong to, but the nearby monthly meetings also. Now, these meetings create minutes, and there are other meetings, such as the quarterly meeting and the yearly meeting, which don't have very much genealogical information, more or less deal with things that monthly meetings can't deal with, but you always want to look at them. You always want to look at the records created by all three of these types of meetings. In my mind, the best record to go after first, and it's so much easier now because these records, for the most part, on Ancestry, but not all records are on Ancestry, and not all records on Ancestry are, in fact, indexed properly. So I tend to sit down and just, if I'm in the right monthly meeting, we'll just sit down and read minutes. My favorite minutes to start with, and I always start with these if I'm going to sit down and read minutes, is the women's minutes, because the women's minutes are the juicy things. They don't hold anything back. In the men's minutes, they might be nice about describing what you did, and in the women's meetings, they're not nice about it at all. So you want to be sure. I always read the women's minutes first if I'm going to go through and read the minutes. Now, because it's so easy to find people on Ancestry in these minutes, you're going to go do the low-hanging fruit, the things that show up in the search screen first, of course, but that never really gives you context. That never gives you some idea about what's going on in the neighborhood. So you want to, if you're going to read them, and I recommend that you do because they're just a joy to read in my mind. And besides, I like reading about vital events and other things. So look at the records created by these meetings. And you can use secondary sources to use as finding aids just to back up the indexing. I find it's easier to go pull a book off the shelf and look at the index for that book. And I recognize that, books have the same problem that Ancestry does. They don't index everything, but it gets me in the right place, and I may be able to get to information much more quickly. I don't trust Hinshaw to give me a complete picture. I trust Hinshaw to give me an incomplete picture. And by Hinshaw, I mean the Encyclopedia of Quaker Research or records, and they're by state. They're big, thick volumes. And the most important thing that I'd like you to do is to never assume that you found it all. Don't stop too soon. That's probably a mantra for me. I have a problem in letting go of things in regards to research. That I can remember some research problems from a decade ago or 2 decades ago, and I'm still looking. Let's go through them one more time. Familiarize yourself with the history of the Society of Friends so that you have context. Know the monthly meeting that they belong to. Know the nearby monthly meetings. Recognize there's also a quarterly meeting and a yearly meeting that you should pay attention to, although they don't have much genealogical information. You want to look at the records created by these meetings. You want to, in my mind, for context, focus on the women's meetings minutes if you are going to sit down and just read. And I love to do that. You should too. That's really the difference between somebody just doing genealogy and picking data out and people who are genealogists, which you know is what my focus is. Don't forget that there are secondary sources out there that you will find useful, and then never assume that you've found it all. So this has been Craig. This has been Just Genealogy. I hope you have a great year. I'm going to have a great year. You'll notice that my setting has changed a little bit, and I look forward to talking to you soon.